have a very full day planned. So welcome, my name's Jane Stoever. I'm a professor here at the law school. Thanks, buddy. Where I direct our domestic violence clinic, in which we represent abuse survivors in a range of case types in civil, criminal, immigration, policy interventions in abuse. And I'm also the director here of the Initiative to End Family Violence, which involves faculty from 21 different departments, 11 different schools across campus, some of whom are here today. And we're involved with community partners in different interdisciplinary research, education, and clinical interventions in abuse. And throughout the fall, the initiative has hosted this fall program series that we've been seeing many of you at. And we appreciate you being part of this series, the critical perspectives on domestic violence in the justice system. It's been a really incredible journey, with the initiative holding programs, and so many of you participating in the programs, with Marissa Alexander, Nia Norn and Colby Lenz, and Connie Burke, and building up to today, our colloquium, Beyond Criminalization. So I'm so excited to welcome you here today to this program that is really inspired by the brilliant and courageous work of Professor Leigh Goodmark and her new book, Decriminalizing Domestic Violence, a Balanced Policy Approach to Intimate Partner Violence. And you're going to be hearing about it all morning, and then copies will be available for sale during the lunch hour if you have not yet read this work. And so Leigh really approaches this thinking that, of course, the criminal justice system has not solved the problem of domestic violence. And her book reveals the need for a multidimensional response to intimate partner violence that includes policies grounded in community, public health, economic, and human rights perspectives and responses. And if you've had the chance yet to read Leigh's book, which came out at the end of September, so this is this is a recent, but it was immediately sold out, and it's a reprint, right? So if you've had the chance to read Leigh's book, you've seen that throughout the book, she is referencing and discussing so many of the scholar activists who are also here today to then respond to her book. And so it's an especially exciting day because we have with us from around the nation individuals who've been doing this groundbreaking work and research and really change-making work on these issues. And so we'll do a little fuller introductions later, but I want to also welcome Mimi Kim, Julie Goldscheid, Deborah Weissman, and Candace Burton, who is here so graciously and fabulous collaborator here on campus because Jamila Stockman was not able to be here today after all. And so we are excited for both to be able to hear Leigh discuss her book, to hear these different responses and reactions from all of these different perspectives. And then part of, you'll see on the program, which if you don't, does everybody have the program? Okay, and we've got stacks of them. You'll see on the program that our morning's work is really building to being able to have a strategic planning conversation and a planning conversation in community about how might we actually implement these ideas. How could our agencies, our governmental responses, our community responses look different and be different, inspired by the morning's work and conversations. And I'll just briefly say a few notes as I approach our work today and the reflections I was having coming together today. One, Leigh's book really starts out and throughout acknowledges the real problem of domestic violence, right? And you're taking domestic violence seriously, and we all recognize the still all too common use of gender-based violence and sexual violence in our society, and our society's historic failure to prevent or to really remedy abuse. And that's so much of what was shown through the Me Too movement in the popularization of it in the last year. It's been going on for 11 years with Tarana Burke starting it, right? In terms of just the ceaseless prevalence of violence in our society and how we need some real radical changes and healing. And we need to tackle these vast, tragic, heartbreaking institutional failures. And we think back to other recent examples like Dr. Larry Nassar, and he discusses these examples too in terms of these heartbreaking examples. And we can consider, with that popularization of the Me Too movement, how some of the last year's activities have displayed some of the same faults of earlier feminist movements. And so we can think about movement politics. And Leigh's book really grapples a lot in this colloquium has quite a lot to do with movement politics. And some of those earlier failures, omitting or silencing certain voices and perspectives. And so when we had the early focus on actors and celebrities, that then later expanded to farm workers, to hotel workers, a group testifying yesterday in Sacramento about bringing attention to the dangers there, and law clerks and other areas and sites of vulnerability. And what the future can be. Because to me, so much of what we've been doing, the work that we've been doing and engaged in here is really about creating that future. And so eager for us to talk today about that future of feminism, the future of gender-based violence responses, and to recognize, of course, the compound trauma histories and the urgency of intersectionality, and not just in our language, but in thinking about what would this actually look like? What would it actually look like for feminist movements against gender-based violence to partner with racial justice and economic justice and other social justice movements, and to do that kind of deep work on those fronts. And thinking quite simply that in not being limited by our imaginations, and how I am daily inspired by my clients and reminded of the need to keep asking survivors, how are you doing? What do you need? What do you want? And to kind of come back to that idea and to really listen and to see if we can deliver. So I wanted to offer a few of these reflections as we start the day. And now to introduce Leigh Goodmark, a professor of law at the University of Maryland, Francis King Carey School of Law, where she teaches family law, gender in the law, and gender violence in the law, and directs a gender violence clinic. This is a clinic that's providing direct representation to domestic violence survivors, sexual violence survivors, trafficking survivors, and survivors of other forms of gender-based violence. While doing the work, and as I've seen her doing this work over the last almost 15 years that I've known Leigh, she's doing the work out in the field now with clients, not for clients, but I would say really with clients and in community, and is writing all the time. And so many law review articles, now multiple books, to really create change and prompt these conversations. And so I'm so excited to now introduce her up here to be able to be in conversation with you and share her work. Thank you, Leigh.
Thank you so much, Jane. We're so lucky, those of us who do this work. We have this amazing small community of people who've known each other forever and worked together in lots of different iterations, and I'd say probably about a quarter of us are here today. So it's really just a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much to the Initiative to End Family Violence for having me, and to all of you for coming. I can't tell you how much I appreciate it. So I want to take you back in time. The year is 1984. If I had been talking to you in 1984, I would have been wearing probably a very bright neon-colored something and would not have had that, at that point, 25 years of working with people subjected to abuse. So 1984, three things happen in 1984 that really kickstart the criminal legal response to intimate partner violence in the United States. So before 1984, anti-violence advocates had started to argue that intimate partner violence should be treated like any other crime. But 1984 is the watershed year, and here's why. First, the Attorney General's Task Force on Family Violence for the first time says domestic violence or intimate partner violence, and I'll go back and forth, is a criminal legal problem. It requires a criminal legal solution. On that task force, for those of you who follow popular culture, then prosecutor Jean Pirro. Second, in 1984, Thurman versus City of Torrington, Connecticut is decided. In that case, Tracy Thurman was awarded $2.3 million after the police failed to prevent what was almost a fatal assault on her. Tracy Thurman had called police numerous times to ask for help. Police were non-responsive up until the time when she was laying on the ground, having been stabbed by her husband, and police stood by while he was able to come and kick her while she was laying on the stretcher and drop their child on top of her. The liability was huge, right? $2.3 million in 1984 dollars, that's a lot of money. And what that led jurisdictions to do was to look for ways to ensure that they would be insulated from that kind of liability should their police failed to take action, for failure to protect people subjected to abuse. The third thing that happened in 1984 was the Minneapolis domestic violence experiment. And the Minneapolis domestic violence experiment looked at the impact of arrest on intimate partner violence. What they found was that arrest decreased recidivism of intimate partner violence. One of the study's authors, Lawrence Sherman, cautioned people that the study would need to be replicated before any real conclusion about the impact of arrest could be formed. And nonetheless, jurisdictions across the United States rushed to adopt mandatory arrest policies. Now, the first mandatory arrest policy was adopted in Oregon prior to the experiment in 1979, but it's really after Sherman and Burke's findings come out in 1984 that you see jurisdictions rush to adopt criminal legal policies. Right? So, just to take us back a step, when I talk about criminalization, what do I mean? I mean a couple of things. One, the enforcement of current laws, right? So there have been laws on the books since the common law that can be applied to intimate partner violence. Assault is a common law felony. It goes back to England, in the 1400s. So that's been around forever. So enforcement of existing laws is one part of it, right? The second part of it is the creation of new laws that specifically criminalized intimate partner violence or enhanced penalties when intimate partners were victimized. So assault plus, for example, if it was an intimate partner, or special laws that characterized intimate partner assaults as different somehow than other things. And the third thing is the procedural changes, and that's really where the action has been in terms of criminalization, is around procedural changes. Two big procedural changes that really change the landscape in terms of the way that the criminal legal system responds to intimate partner violence. The first is mandatory assault, which means exactly what it sounds like. Mandatory assault. Mandatory arrest. I'm glad that I caught that. Yeah, you must assault your partner. That's clickbait though, Jane. Somebody's gonna pick that up and run with it. Mandatory arrest, which means exactly what it sounds like, that if police have probable cause to make an arrest in a case of intimate partner violence, they must make that arrest, regardless of what anyone on the scene has to say about it, regardless of what the person subjected to abuse wants to see happen, no discretion, right? And the idea behind mandatory arrest was that police have misused their discretion pretty handily, and they don't get it anymore. We're gonna take it away from them in these cases because clearly they can't use it, right? The history pre-mandatory arrest, and it was in the training manuals for police of the time, said if you go to a situation, it's a domestic situation, you tell the guy to take a walk around the block. Right? In the training manuals of the time. Police had misused their discretion. The idea behind mandatory arrest was to make that not happen. So mandatory arrest comes into being, right? Cities and jurisdictions adopt mandatory arrest rates go up, and the anti-violence movement looks to prosecutors and says, well, now we've got all these arrests, but why are we not having successful prosecution? Prosecutors say, it's the fault of our star witness. The person who's been abused doesn't want to testify, and we can't do this without them, so we don't bring these cases. We can't prove them. Two things happen in response to that, one of which is much less problematic than the other. The first thing that happens is evidence-based prosecution. Evidence-based prosecution is simply the idea that we will investigate a domestic violence crime the way that we investigate anything else, particularly a homicide, right? We'll do it as though there's not going to be a live witness there to testify. We'll do a better job with the physical scene investigation. We'll do a better job in taking statements and taking photographs and getting all of those kinds of things that would enable a prosecutor to bring a case even if there is no victim to testify. The more problematic thing was something called no-drop prosecution. No-drop prosecution is the idea that a prosecutor's office is going to bring a prosecution no matter what the victim wants. That if they have sufficient evidence to do it, they're going to do it. And there are two kinds of no-drop prosecution. There's soft no-drop prosecution and hard no-drop prosecution. Soft no-drop prosecution is using incentives to get victims to cooperate. We're going to provide you with additional services. There are victim witness advocates. We will help you apply for crime victim compensation money. There are things that we can do to make this process easier for you. We will do those things. That's soft no-drop. The real issue is with hard no-drop policies. Hard no-drop policies say, you're the witness, you're going to testify, and we'll do whatever it takes to make that happen. We will subpoena you over your objection. If you fail to show up pursuant to the subpoena, we will ask for you to be arrested. We will incarcerate you using material witness warrants until such time as you provide that testimony. It is hard to know how prevalent hard no drop is. The last study that I saw of the kind of who uses what is 96. And at that time, about a third of prosecutors' offices were using no drop prosecution, and we didn't really know who was doing what. The way that we track no drop prosecution now is through the use of material witness warrants, and only when they show up in the media. So you'll see a news story that says prosecutor has woman jailed, victim of domestic violence jailed. There's a lawsuit right now in New Orleans called Singleton versus Cannizzaro that's all about the use of material witness warrants and also fake subpoenas, but that's another conversation, to bring witnesses in. You may have heard in Harris County, Texas, about the rape victim who was jailed for almost 2 months because prosecutors said that she said she wasn't coming. That's how we know about this. It's hard to get a real sense of how often it's used, but I would argue, and I know it's used in Baltimore City, in where I practice, because I see it happen. I would argue it's more prevalent than we think it is, particularly as to the use of subpoenas and warrants, and material witness warrants. So that's what I mean by criminalization. And although the criminal legal response was kind of ramping up prior to the inception of the Violence Against Women Act in 1994, VAWA really kickstarts criminalization. It stakes out the federal government's position that criminalization should be the primary response to intimate partner violence, and then puts significant resources behind it. So VAWA was part of the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act of 1994. That's not a coincidence, right? It's very much a statement about the way that both anti-violence advocates at the time and federal government saw kind of the ways in which we should be responding to intimate partner violence. And you have to understand it in the larger context of that Crime Control Act. So Joe Biden, who is widely understood to be kind of the motivating force behind VAWA, right, the primary sponsor and a huge supporter of this work being the criminal part of this work, Biden also said at that time, Republicans are finding out it is no longer legitimate to say the Democrats are soft on crime, because guess what? What has every major crime bill that has gotten this far been? A Democratic crime bill. A Democratic president wants 100,000 new cops. A Democratic president wants to build 125,000 new prison cells. So you can't understand VAWA without understanding that it is very much embedded in a criminal legal context, and that it wasn't a coincidence or an unintended effect, right? This was what people had set out to do. Anti-violence advocates were ambivalent about this, particularly anti-violence advocates of color. And it is important to note from jump that there were women of color from the very beginning saying, this is a bad idea. This is a bad idea for us. It is a bad idea for our communities. But it's fair to say, I think, that the majority of the anti-violence advocates working at that time felt like bringing those resources into the system was important. Many of them supported and continue to support criminalization. And those voices were really muted. And so that's kind of how we get to where we are. So as a practical matter, the way that VAWA has affected all this is really two things. First, criminalization is the funding priority, both in services and in research. And second, VAWA has been used to promote criminalization policies like mandatory arrest. So for example, in the original iteration of VAWA, you had to have a mandatory arrest policy to be able to be eligible for funding under the Violence Against Women Act. The Office on Violence Against Women has backed off that since then, but it's still required that you have either a mandatory arrest or a preferred arrest policy to be eligible for VAWA grant funds. So still a very strong thumb on the scale of criminalization. And you have to understand all of this against the bigger backdrop of mass incarceration in the United States. So the United States currently incarcerates somewhere around 2 million people. The numbers have been dropping more recently, and so I want to hedge that a little bit. Another 5 million people are under the scrutiny of parole and probation officers. And any real effort to decrease mass incarceration requires addressing violent crimes like intimate partner violence. We are not going to end mass incarceration by letting people who use drugs out of jail. That creaming, that kind of taking the easy cases out, is still going to leave a huge prison population in the United States. As Mark Maurer and David Cole have explained, even if we released everyone imprisoned for drugs tomorrow, the United States would still have 1.7 million people behind bars, an incarceration rate 4 times that of many Western European nations. And though we don't have great numbers on this, a significant number of those people are likely incarcerated for intimate partner violence. And I can give you one stat, the one that I do have, which is Vermont. In Vermont, 20% of the jail population is there as a result of intimate partner violence. I heard a rumor that the Rikers population in New York City was somewhere between 10 and 15% intimate partner violence, but no one will commit to those numbers. But I think they're probably accurate. So you see that we're talking about a sizable chunk of people here. If we're talking about ways to address mass incarceration, we have to be thinking about intimate partner violence. Now, the question I think that it's logical to ask is criminalization affecting rates of intimate partner violence? Is it working, right? Because if it's working, this is a really hard conversation to have. There are 2 real questions I think we have to confront. One, is it working? 2, even if it is the cost too high? So let's start with 1, right? Is it working? As to the first question, it is not at all clear that criminalization is working if what we mean by working is that rates of intimate partner violence are decreasing as a result of criminalization. Since 1994, rates of intimate partner violence in the United States have fallen significantly. So has the overall crime rate. And in fact, between 1994 and the year 2000, rates of intimate partner violence decreased exactly as much as the overall crime rate decreased, at a time when we are putting hundreds of millions of dollars specifically into the criminal legal system's response to intimate partner violence. We're not doing that for other crimes. The rates are falling the same amount. Interestingly, though, from 2000 to 2010, the decrease in the rate of intimate partner violence was less than the decrease in the crime rate generally. So again, while we're putting hundreds of millions of dollars into the system, we're not seeing the same return that we're getting just on the crime rate generally. So fair to question, I think, whether that infusion of funds is actually working in the sense that it's lowering the rates. A second way to look at this is, does criminalization deter intimate partner violence? And the answer to that is, it's complicated. Studies have failed to find that the existence of laws criminalizing intimate partner violence deters the behavior. Arrest, as we've already talked about, has effects on recidivism that range from modest to non-existent, and in some populations, arrest has actually exacerbated commission of intimate partner violence. This is why Sherman said replication was so important. One study found that the relationship between arrest and future violence was entirely attributable to pre-arrest differences in risk of offending. People who were gonna offend for other reasons are more likely to commit intimate partner violence. And the studies also show us that intimate partner violence is likely to be part of somebody's overall criminal package. These are people who are offending on lots of different fronts, and they're offending a lot, right? There's a very small number of people doing a lot of offending, both in the context of intimate partner violence and in criminalization more generally. Studies on the deterrent effect of prosecution have not been persuasive, although one study found that conviction may have an effect on recidivism. That effect disappears when ongoing monitoring and accountability are not part of the sentence. Just convicting somebody isn't enough. You basically have to sit on them afterwards. And if you're closely monitoring them, then the conviction may have an effect, which I think begs the question of, if we're just closely monitoring people without convicting them, is it possible that we could get a similar kind of effect? Studies find that incarceration alone similarly has no effect on recidivism, but that incarceration plus post-jail monitoring may deter future violence. Again, it's that idea of monitoring. So this failure to find a strong effect can be the product of several things. One is inconsistent application and enforcement of the laws. There's always been critique of the fact that we've never fully implemented the laws at all. Some would argue that we don't know whether criminalization is working because we still haven't tried it. That even jurisdictions with mandatory arrest don't engage in mandatory arrest all the time, that our rates are still fairly low. So that's one argument. Two, the lack of a credible threat of punishment, right? The only way deterrence works is if you think you will actually be punished. And because conviction rates are still low and incarceration is still rare, it may not be working for that reason. Third, recidivism is an incredibly problematic measure. of whether something is working or not, particularly in the context of intimate partner violence. And that's true in this context because we use rearrest as the proxy for recidivism. And that misses a lot, right? It misses all of the non-criminal forms of abuse that people engage in. They may no longer be hitting their partner, but they may be engaging in serious emotional, psychological, economic, spiritual, reproductive abuse, none of which is illegal. It also misses the fact that many people who've used the system and found it to have failed them don't come back. So if you've already engaged in prosecution, you've already seen your partner prosecuted and they're still committing violence, you're not going back to the system. You're looking for a different way to solve the problem. And so the recidivism numbers are probably unhelpful. This is all against a backdrop in which intimate partner violence is underreported, right? So we don't have a great picture by numbers of who's doing what to whom. And understanding that much intimate partner violence is committed by the same actors, which suggests that they are not deterred by the intervention of the system. So, is it working? There are clear benefits to the criminal legal system, and I don't want to shortchange those. I also don't ever want to be heard to be saying that a survivor should not have options about how they want to address the abuse in their lives. I think that's important. But I also think it's important that people understand what this really looks like. So here are the benefits, right? Criminalization. Please stop a violent incident in that moment. They are the only first responders who we've given any power to do that, right? So one could ask that question, should we be thinking about who first responders should be? But the reality is right now, if you want to stop a violent incident, you need to call the police. That's the only real option that you have. The criminal legal system can create separation between violent people and their partners through criminal orders of protection, through prosecution if it results in a conviction, which also results in incarceration. We can get separation, at least for short periods of time. The system does provide some resources for people subjected to abuse through victim witness advocates, through crime victim compensation funds, and through community-based organizations. So it's important to note that a lot of the money from VAWA goes not just to courts, cops, and prosecutors, but also to community-based organizations that are helping courts, cops, and prosecutors, and those resources are available as a function of criminalization. And finally, the last benefit is really the expressive function of the law. It means something to say something is illegal. It means something to say, as a community, we've decided this is the kind of thing for which people can be incarcerated, right? Criminalization does that for us. But that brings us to the second question about whether the cost is too high. So let me suggest to you that here are some of the costs of criminalization. First, criminalization of intimate partner violence is part of a larger decision we've made as a society to govern through crime. We have very few resources going into social services and community-based services and the other kinds of safety net services that traditionally we've looked to deal with some social problems. And we've put all those into the carceral system. And we've decided that this is how we're going to deal with this particular social problem, like so many others, like mental illness, like homelessness. We're going to deal with it through crime. I think that's problematic. The criminal system harms people subjected to abuse. If there is one unintended consequence of criminalization that to me is more problematic than any other, it is the way in which the criminalization of survivors has become a huge issue. Not that it wasn't before, but so much worse now. So with the inception of mandatory arrest, not surprisingly, arrest rates skyrocket, right? You got to do it, you do it, arrest rates skyrocket. Who gets arrested more than anybody else after mandatory arrest? Women. Right? And so I should have done my caveat. I forgot to do it. Not all survivors are women. 85%, the latest federal statistics say that 85% of the victims of domestic violence are women. That 15% may include dual arrests. It certainly includes same-sex relationships, and also it includes heterosexual relationships. But this is a gendered problem. It remains a gendered problem, notwithstanding the fact that there are male survivors of violence, right? And arrest rates of women go through the roof. Dual arrests, the arrests of both parties, also increase significantly, and there are some jurisdictions that are still dealing with this issue 25 years, I was trying to think how old I was, 25 years after the first mandatory arrest laws come into being. Connecticut is right now trying to figure out how to do this legislatively to deal with their mandatory arrest problem, which they have had consistently since the inception of mandatory arrest, that arrest rates of women, of survivors, have been very, very high. Criminalization has also increased women's interaction with the state in really problematic ways, particularly around the child welfare system. So once you have police coming into a home, one of the collateral consequences of that is that people are looking at your parenting. And if you are a low-income woman, if you're a woman of color, they're looking at your parenting more closely. And so that's a problematic consequence. And then there are kind of the philosophical questions about agency. What does it mean to have policies that say to people subjected to abuse, you don't get to make decisions about how we intervene in the most important relationships in your life, that the state is going to make those decisions for you because we're going to assume that you are too coercively controlled to be able to make those decisions. And coercive control as a theory, I think, is an incredibly important theory, but it's used sometimes to justify the deprivation of agency from people who are absolutely capable of making decisions. I've represented, I want to say at this point, it's got to be 1,000 people. I think that's probably fair. In the last 25 years, I think I've probably represented 1,000 women. I've never met one who couldn't make decisions about her life, no matter how controlled they were. And some of them were in relationships where they were incredibly controlled. But they could still make decisions about their lives. We've taken that away from people through the inception of mandatory policies. Criminalization harms people of color. That's not surprising to anybody. The same racism that infests the rest of the criminal legal system is found in the response to intimate partner violence as well. Domestic violence laws are disproportionately enforced against people of color. There's an old study from Milwaukee County where African American people made up 24% of the population, but 66% of the defendants in intimate partner violence cases. That's not unusual. A new study on the enforcement of criminal stay-away orders similarly finds disproportionate impacts on African American and indigenous populations. So those are the harms. And I want to talk specifically about 3 harms because I think that they're a good kind of way to understand the rest of the book, I guess. And those 3 harms have to do with employment, community stability, and incarceration and violence and trauma. So prior to being incarcerated, 2/3 of male inmates are employed. About a half of them serve as primary sources of support for their families. Ex-offenders earn less, they're employed in bad jobs with high turnover and little earning potential. And upon release, ex-offenders find it almost impossible to find work. And of course, that's harder for men of color than it is for white people. Incarceration depresses wages and it depresses the annual income of former inmates. And as I'll talk to you about shortly, this is a particular problem in the context of intimate partner violence. Former inmates are also often released into unstable communities that are challenged by poverty and high unemployment rates. The loss of community members to jail weakens community ties and deprives communities of those who should be raising children and contributing to the economy. All of this decreases the community's capacity to respond to violence, and it diverts resources out of communities and into the prison system. In terms of trauma, the violence that offenders experience in prison is recycled into their interpersonal relationships. So it's pretty ironic that what we do is we say, we're punishing you for violence. And as that punishment, we are sending you to a place where you are likely to be a witness to or a victim of violence. Somewhere between 10 and 20% of prisoners report physical abuse. About 10% of state prisoners report sexual abuse. And that trauma that people experience during their incarceration leads into post-traumatic stress disorder and other kinds of mental health issues, which offenders then take out with them into the community and back into their intimate relationships. And not surprisingly, post-traumatic stress disorder is strongly correlated with the perpetration of intimate partner violence. So we are basically sending people into a situation in which they are more likely to commit an intimate partner violence on the back end. All right, so if not criminalization, what? And that's really going to be a lot of the focus of the latter part of today, because basically what I did, the unique contribution I think the book makes from me is this first part about why it is that criminalization is so problematic. And when I say unique contribution, I mean just like taking and building on everybody else's work. The collaboration in this field is amazing, and we've been so lucky to have this continuing conversation among a group of us over the last, I'd say, 5 to 7 years, really trying to focus on how can we do this differently. But I'll tell you, the second half of the book is really a conglomeration of what those three people have said, and or three of those four people have said. Candace, I don't know as well, or I don't know her work as well, but three of those people, really what I did was go, here's what they said, and they're really smart, and I think they're right. So you'll hear from them.
You know me, you'll think I'm smart.
I do already think you're smart. It's just not in the book. So what I did in the book was to say, so if not criminalization, what, right? And what I would encourage people to think about is to look through different lenses at intimate partner violence, to look at intimate partner violence as an economic problem, a public health problem, a community problem, and a human rights problem. So in not very much time, I'm going to give you just a brief overview of why I think those are the right lenses. In terms of the economy, intimate partner violence costs the United States economy as much as $67 billion annually. And women lose as much as $18 million annually in earnings as a result of intimate partner violence. These effects begin as early as adolescence. Women who've been subjected to teen dating violence earn $3,900 less than those who did not experience violence. And that deficit is attributable to the impact on education during their teenage years. Healthcare costs for people subjected to abuse are 19% higher. Women who seek protective orders lose more than $1,000 in income in the year after they seek protection. They never recoup that loss. They consistently stay behind others. Intimate partner violence costs employers about $5.8 billion annually in healthcare and lost productivity. The effects of intimate partner violence are felt disproportionately by low-income women and women who live in severe poverty. 2/3 of low-income women have been subjected to abuse, and the lower your income is, the more likely you are to have been subjected to intimate partner violence. Women with significant debt are also more likely to be subjected to intimate partner violence. There are relationships between intimate partner violence and neighborhood disadvantage. Intimate partner violence is more prevalent in low-income neighborhoods. Couples who experience intimate partner violence are more likely to be economically vulnerable and to live in these disadvantaged neighborhoods. And then there's economic abuse, which I don't have time to talk to you about, but just suffice it to say that there is a whole way, right, a whole range of behaviors that are specific to decreasing somebody's their earning power, their potential, creating debt, none of which are illegal, and all of which are incredibly problematic, and for some people more problematic than being hit. And I should say, right, I don't discount physical violence, I really don't. But my clients consistently, over the time that I've done this work, over the last 25 years, that's where you're supposed to go, no, you don't look old enough, have said to me that while the physical abuse is bad, all of the other stuff is worse. The emotional abuse is worse. The economic abuse is worse. Being homeless with your kids is worse, right? And so it's important that we understand that there are things that we haven't criminalized, and God knows I am not suggesting that we criminalize them, only that we recognize how important they are to a survivor's experience of abuse and think about the problem differently as a result. In the realm of economics, particularly important to look at the impact on men. So, men's poor work history predicts risk for perpetration of intimate partner violence. Male under- and unemployment is probably the single most important demographic risk factor for the commission of intimate partner violence. Think about that for a second. So we send people to jail. And what happens to them when they come out of jail? Or when they don't go to jail, but they have a criminal record? They can't get jobs, which exacerbates the risk for intimate partner violence, the thing we're trying to eradicate in the first place. Studies show a correlation between income and intimate partner violence along a number of different kinds of dimensions, but suffice it to say that all of that supports the idea that the less money you have, the greater the poverty that you live in, and the more difficult it is for your partner to find work, the more likely you are to be experiencing intimate partner violence. Part of this is about masculinity and the way that we understand masculinity both here and in other places as well. Masculinity is really tied to the idea of being a provider. And economic success through work is one of the hallmarks of American masculinity, and I learned all of this from Deborah Weissman. The loss of work has been linked to a host of physical and mental health problems. Economic insecurity drives stress within the family. The shame and powerlessness associated with joblessness drives intimate partner violence. So, what do we do about it? right? How do we deal with intimate partner violence as an economic problem? The book has a number of different things in it. I have a feeling, I know Deborah's going to talk about some of this, so I'm going to skip part of what I was going to say, except to say that the way that the movement has really looked at it is to do financial literacy, and that is not working. It's good for what it is, maybe, for this far. She's going to tell you it's not even good for that. But it's not addressing the core problems, right? The core structural problems about male joblessness and globalization and the loss of union power and the inability to keep good jobs and a host of other things that would really put money into women's hands, right? Putting economic power directly into women's hands, which I think is really an essential component of all of this. In terms of public health, it's undeniable that intimate partner violence is a healthcare problem. Intimate partners are responsible for over half of the femicides in the United States. Intimate partner violence is linked to a host of physical and mental health problems and is responsible for about 486,000 visits to hospital emergency rooms annually. But we don't need to look at this as a healthcare problem. We need to look at it as a public health problem, right? And public health is different in that it focuses on prevention. And prevention is what we're not really doing at all. So there are great programs, little isolated pockets of programs doing really cool things. And as systematically, as a policy response to intimate partner violence in the United States, prevention is not our focus. The things we have done, the evidence is not great for. So for example, abuser intervention programs, the evidence is pretty mixed on. And part of the problem is few of these programs have been properly evaluated. And even fewer show positive results. But there are interesting and innovative programs that are out there that are trying to bring in community, that are trying to help think through some of the root causes of intimate partner violence. And I would say this is the other part of the problem in terms of at least abuser intervention. We are still looking at intimate partner violence through the feminist narrative that says intimate partner violence is about power and control, right? How many of you have heard that before? Intimate partner violence, all about power and control, that's all it is. And the problem with that narrative is that it describes the outcome of intimate partner violence, but it may not describe the motivation. When you talk to people who use violence against their partners, and this is not mine, Ellen Pence, who was the creator of the Duluth Abuse Intervention Project, one of the most important projects in the United States, shortly before she died said, that's the outcome. But when you talk to guys in these programs, it's not what they were trying to accomplish. We need to understand better what motivates violence. Imposing kind of this feminist narrative, it's a feminist political narrative, and I identify as feminist, so it's an internal critique. Imposing a feminist political narrative on a much more complex problem has kept us from developing solutions that are really getting at the roots of why people are abusive. And when you look at, for example, the evidence around adverse childhood experiences, you come to know that a lot of folks who are using violence experienced violence as children, experienced child abuse or neglect. And the more ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, that you've had, the more likely you are to be perpetrating violence. We have done a poor job of being able to hold two ideas in our hands at the same time. The idea that someone could have been victimized and experienced trauma, and the idea that someone then perpetrates. And until we can hold both of those ideas in our hands at the same time, and kind of hate the sin, love the sinner, in a very kind of, easy way of saying it, we're not going to be able to stop intimate partner violence. Because until we deal with the trauma that many people who use violence have experienced, we're not going to make any real impact. Lots of other kinds of public health prevention things that I could talk about, work with adolescents and the interesting work that's going on around coaching boys into men and various school-based programs, work around edutainment and the idea that we can shift societal norms around violence by creating culture-wide entertainment experiences that also inform, right? That also provide information about intimate partner violence. And then population interventions. So one, alcohol, right? You're 11 times more likely to use violence if you've been drinking. Injuries are more severe if you've been drinking. there are things that we can do to decrease the availability of alcohol that could have an impact on intimate partner violence. And then I have to imagine I'm preaching to the choir when I say the availability of handguns in the United States is a huge driver of intimate partner violence. Guns are involved in about half of intimate partner violence homicides. You're 5 times more likely to be killed if your partner has a gun. We need better gun control in this country. We also need gun violence restraining orders, which keep guns out of people's hands. I think one of the interesting things about kind of this current moment is that every time there's a mass shooting, I'd say within the day afterwards, you start to see, and this person committed violence against women, right, within the family or in other places. And what I think is problematic about that, it's true, so don't misunderstand what I'm saying. But what's problematic about that framing is that it seems to suggest that if we had just locked all these guys up for intimate partner violence or some kind of violence against women, they would not then have been available to do a mass shooting. And I think that's problematic, right? One, because sentences aren't that long. Unless we're going to lock everybody up for the rest of their lives, we're not going to eliminate the threat. And 2, because as always, right, it's an after-the-fact response that doesn't deal with any of the root causes. If people are perpetrating violence against women, we need to understand why they're doing that, get guns out of their hands, and try to figure out what can make them change. But sending people to jail, and most domestic violence offenses are still prosecuted as misdemeanors. Most carry no more than about 6 months of jail time, if people do jail time at all. This is not the solution that's going to keep these people from perpetrating mass violence down the line. It's just not going to stop it. Community level factors. Oh my gosh, Jane, when did we start? Because I don't want to go too long.
No, but I think, do you have about 10 more minutes?
I can do about 10 more minutes. Okay. My apologies to those of you who were looking for your break right now. Community. So community level factors are associated with higher rates of intimate partner violence, as I've said. Living in a neighborhood with high unemployment or low average male literacy rates or concentrated poverty is correlated with intimate partner violence. Partly this is about lack of social cohesion within communities, and this goes back 20 years to the bowling wall alone, and this idea that in the United States we're so fragmented that we don't have strong communities that are intervening, that know each other, right, and that are intervening with each other. And there's also a community cynicism about law, particularly in low-income and disadvantaged communities, right? If you live in those communities, you see, 1, that the law over-intervenes, and it locks up lots of people of color, and 2, that it under-intervenes, and that it's not there when you actually need it to be there. And that's a real problem that we have to grapple with, because communities of color in many instances are not just saying, stay out. They're also saying, come in when we actually need you. We need to think about how that plays out in the context of intimate partner violence. There are community level factors that can be protective. So looking at, for example, the built environment of a community. I found this so fascinating. The architecture of a neighborhood or the number of vacant houses and lots in a neighborhood is related to the amount of gun violence within that neighborhood. And gun violence decreases when older abandoned housing stock is rehabilitated. That's directly linked to intimate partner violence, right? That's directly linked to this idea that more social structure, more order can help us to decrease violence. Social supports. Violence decreases where social ties within neighborhoods are strong and where residents are willing to intervene. And interacting with social networks can increase the scrutiny on a couple's relationship, which may prompt others to step in to protect the abused partner, to bring cultural or religious prescriptions against violence to bear, or to confront abusive partners about their behavior. Family and friends can provide material and emotional support to people subjected to abuse. And if you have that kind of social support, that is linked to both a lower likelihood of being subjected to intimate partner violence and a decreased frequency of violence. Interestingly, intimate partner violence is less prevalent among recent immigrants than it is among those who've spent longer in the United States. And that has to do with those close cultural ties still, right? Recent immigrants are much more likely to be closely linked than folks who've been here for a longer period of times. And that speaks to the importance of neighborhood and community cohesion. So there are ways in which we can get communities more involved, right? And there are kind of 3 ways that I talk about in the book. And it's incredibly humbling for Mimi to be here because Mimi created one of the ways, essentially. And I know she's going to talk about that, so I'm not going to. So one is around kind of community organizing. How do we get communities to see intimate partner violence as a problem, deal with stereotypes or myths or misapprehensions about intimate partner violence, and think differently about how to engage with members in the community? So there's a project, for example, in the Midwest called the Shanti Project, which worked with the Gujarati Indian community. And it was a social marketing campaign that was designed to educate the community about the scope of intimate partner violence, to stress the importance of communication and respect, to challenge traditions and values that created a context for violence. And it did that through seminars, through radio announcements, through articles in local publications and brochures, and had an impact in changing the way that the community saw the violence. Other programs really look to survivors to say, help us understand, what do you need? What would work for you? How do we raise the visibility in the community? And in Baltimore, where I live, there's a group called Gather Together that's doing exactly that. That's doing listening campaigns with survivors to say, tell us, how should we be thinking about this problem and what do you need? That did a public art project that had signs on every bus so that as you were moving through the city of Baltimore, you were being asked to think about, what is the impact of this problem on our community and what can we do about it? Community accountability is the thing that Mimi kind of created, and I'm just going to leave that to her entirely, except to say that her work blows my mind. It has for years and years. I think she's absolutely amazing. So I'm going to leave that to Mimi. But there are lots of ways that we can think about community accountability, and the third is restorative justice. So restorative justice is really a way of thinking about harm instead of crime. It asks 3 questions. What was the harm? What was the impact of that harm on the person who was hurt? And what are we going to do about it, right? How can we hold someone accountable as an individual, through a community, for these harms? Restorative justice is getting a lot of talk right now, partly because the 2018 version of the Violence Against Women Act is actually providing some money to think about restorative justice in the context of intimate partner violence. I will say the feminist anti-violence community has been very, very worried about the use of restorative justice. And partly that's about concerns about safety, and partly it's about concerns about taking something that the anti-violence movement worked so hard to make public and saying, no, it's okay to deal with it privately again. I am a big proponent of the use of restorative justice. And the reason that I'm a big proponent of it is because people need options. And while public systems work for some people, they don't work for all people. And particularly for people who are never going to go to the state for whatever reason, because their communities have been oppressed by the state, because they personally have had bad experiences with the state, whatever reason that is. For people who are living in small religious or cultural communities where going to the state means ostracism, and for people who, no matter what the state does, are going to co-parent after all this mess gets dealt with, those people need an option other than criminalization. And I think restorative justice in certain circumstances done right, may be one of those options. There are lots of caveats there, and I'm happy to unpack some of those with you. So, if I could turn the page, I'd know exactly where I was. All right, human rights. So very briefly, because I know Julie will talk about this, and it's really Julie's work that I relied on a lot to think about the human rights framing, and our friend Carey Bettinger-Lopez, who's not here, who's done a tremendous amount of work on this as well. But the human rights lens situates prosecution and punishment within a much wider set of strategies designed to deal with intimate partner violence. It makes prosecution and punishment just 2 of the 5 Ps that I bet Julie's going to talk about. So the 5 Ps really are the prevent, protect, prosecute, punish, and provide reparation. I know Julie's going to do more with that. But I think it's important to see that there's a way to think about this problem that doesn't get rid of criminalization altogether, but makes it just part, and not even the majority part, of the way in which we respond to intimate partner violence in the United States. So the big disappointment of this talk is that I don't actually advocate for complete decriminalization. When I say decriminalization, what I mean by that is de-emphasizing the criminal legal response to intimate partner violence. We're not going to completely decriminalize. I think it's unlikely, highly unlikely, and it might be unwise. There are people among us who need not to be among us. I have clients whose partners need not to be among us, at least for some period of time. There needs, I have not gotten to prison abolition. I feel like I'm getting there, and maybe I'll keep, I often introduce myself as I'm a recovering carceral feminist. I certainly, if I had given this talk in 1994, you could have knocked me over with a feather if I had thought I would be saying any of these things now. I very much came from a place where I thought that criminalization was the way to handle these problems, and it's been a long evolution. And I may evolve to prison abolition, but I'm not there quite yet. So what I think we do need to do is, one, we need to rethink the use of violence as punishment. The punishment that we give people through incarceration should be the loss of liberty, not the loss of dignity, not the loss of safety. So we need to rethink prison as a space and how we incarcerate people. We need to create and enforce laws like the Prison Rape Elimination Act that are specifically designed to eliminate that one source of trauma, right, through incarceration. We need to address the trauma of people who are incarcerated. So in Folsom, for example, they're doing really interesting work through something called Inside Circle, where guys are reflecting on the use of violence with the support of other men and engaging men in peer groups to do this kind of work. We need to have people getting educations so that they're work ready when they come out, so that we don't create this cycle of unemployment. We need people to have ties to the world so that they can have stronger communities. Second thing is, we need to understand the origins of violence. We need to understand why people are violent. We need not to be using shame-based punishment. Shame-based punishment just drives trauma, right? And there's really interesting work going on through the Veterans Administration, actually, through the Safe at Home Men's Program, which is looking at the correlation of post-traumatic stress disorder among veterans and perpetration of intimate partner violence, and getting great results. We need to be building on programs like that. And the third thing that we absolutely have to be doing is building a broader movement. We need to be working with anti-poverty folks. We need to be working with anti-racism folks. We need to be working with mental health folks. We need to be working with substance abuse folks. Deb, it was the person who really made me see this so clearly. She has done some work on on cases where the anti-violence movement took positions in opposition to other movements, right, that were doing anti-racism work or other kinds of social justice work, and said, look at how what we're doing is undermining this broader movement. Where are the places where we can come together? We need to be doing that kind of work. There are about 800,000 incidents of intimate partner violence every year. If we arrested, tried, convicted, and incarcerated people for each one of these incidents, we would increase mass incarceration in the United States by 1/3. That's not a viable solution. And then we would be exacerbating the problem of intimate partner violence by exposing people to all of the things that come with criminalization. So we need to be thinking about prevention. We need to be thinking about the causes of violence and how we get to those causes. And I think the next phase of the anti-violence movement really needs to be dedicated to that work.